Wow, they finally took a crack at making a movie out of Crisis on Infinite Earths. How did this animated thing turn out? I'll give you my thoughts. Thanks for checking out my content. By the way, if you want more of my perspective on DC Comics, I do a weekly video series covering the DC Comics for that week on the DC Universe Infinite subscription service. There's a monthly podcast, all under the title Essential Issues. So be sure to check that out if you'd like more of my thoughts on DC Comics and their characters. But I'm Peter Franson from christiangeekcentral.com and Spirit Blade Productions. This is my uncut review of Justice League Crisis on Infinite Earths Part 1. The IMDb synopsis very deceptively says, the Anti-Monitor, the Monitor's evil counterpart, is released in the DC multiverse and begins to destroy the different Earths that compose it. The Monitor attempts to recruit heroes from across the multiverse, but is murdered. None of that happens. Well, no, that's not true. The Anti-Monitor's not in the story. Did the Monitor get murdered by the end? I don't know. There were brief moments where I zoned out for a little bit, which already tells you a little something of my thoughts. So let's talk about what this basic animal feels like. Well, it's part one of what is said to be a trilogy, so I would imagine they'll be stretched out over 2024. I don't think we have release dates for all three of them yet, but that's usually, in the past, how the pacing of these animated movies is about 4 months apart, I think, 3 to 4 months. So that would be my guess. I read the comic of Crisis on Infinite Earths for the first time in the 90s. And at the time, it was originally published in the mid 80s, and I read it first in the mid 90s. And at that time, I was really getting into comic books for the first time on a more regular basis. And it was like this avalanche introduction to the DC universe, cramming so many characters who fit in saying their code name of their hero or whatever in conversation. It was really clunky. And it was just an effort to bring together all these different properties of DC Comics and fix the clutter of the multiverse that they'd created, because DC had purchased all these different comic book companies and consolidated them into the DC multiverse. And the multiverse was used to explain, where all these characters come from and what their tenuous connections to the DC universe were. Well, they were cleaning up a big mess, creating one streamlined continuity that everyone was going to kind of commute to. And that's what Crisis on Infinite Earths was essentially about in publishing history. And so, as you can imagine, that is a huge, chaotic mess of an idea to try and turn into a movie. I think Bruce Timm said years ago that, it was a big event, but it wouldn't make a very good movie. And I think that is true if you go back and try to read that story. I have not watched the Tomorrowverse shared continuity DC animated movies, but I do have general familiarity with DC Comics and their characters as a longtime fan, and that was enough for me to just jump in right here. The story is told in a pretty non-linear fashion because Barry Allen, the Flash, is experiencing these time jumps. I think he briefly referenced something that happened maybe in a recent Tomorrowverse story that explains why he's kind of bouncing all over the place, at least mentally or somehow, across different parts of his lifespan. And then he learns of this coming destruction of the multiverse, and so he's also jumping through parallel universes, parallel Earths and stuff, and he is kind of in the mix as the Monitor, or a Monitor, I should say, a kind of a watcher of all the multiverse, brings heroes of multiple Earths together to try and find a solution. So in that regard, it really functions as a disaster movie. You've got these giant antimatter waves that are washing over cities at a time, and there's absolutely nothing that can stop them. What do the heroes do in the face of inevitable doom? That's kind of what this story is about, and really what a lot of it was about in premise in the original comic book. But Barry and his girlfriend, fiance, wife, Iris, their romance is really at the core. And you see kind of like those various stages of their romance because, as I said, he's jumping through different times in his life. And so over the course of this movie, we get snapshots of them meeting and their, more than snapshots, I mean like scenes that actually develop and give you a sense of that time of their lives. So it takes you through their life and their marriage, even into old age. And, I bring a 22-year marriage with with me into this experience. And I think that definitely enhanced it for me emotionally. I found it especially moving near the end. But all the heroes, well, not all of them, but all the big players get some emotional beats at the end. And I think that's important for a movie that's about a disaster. It's about, okay, the inevitability of death. And so in some ways that these emotional beats are satisfying reflections on these characters' lives as in the context of impending death, and that's something that we all kind of can find ourselves reflecting on. And so I think it's sensible and it works well for them to give time to those moments here. That said, there are plenty of action moments throughout, but I would say that the first third of the movie, largely the action is about an early Justice League conflict with Amazo, the android that can imitate Justice Leaguers' powers. And I think that conflict could have been pretty much cut with just a little bit of reworking and not been a part of the story. This movie was already longer, I think, than any DC animated movie I've seen up to this point. It was 93 minutes, and they usually come in at around 79, 80 minutes, something like that. So I think that maybe could have been cut, but then it was probably an issue related to the pacing of the whole trilogy and what plot beats, where each one was going to start and end. So that's why, surprisingly, it feels like a little bit of filler when I'm not used to that in these DC movies. Or maybe they also wanted to have some combat action, because outside of the Amazo business, the action is largely about just surviving. It's not about punching bad guys or big combat sequences. It's about trying to work together in dire circumstances and trying to save people as things are getting destroyed and all that kind of stuff. So maybe they felt like, well, we got to have some kind of superhero combat in here, so let's do this Amazo thing. At any rate, that part of the movie I found the least interesting, and I kind of checked out a little bit here and there in that part of the movie. Also, because of the nonlinear aspect of the storytelling, which I thought was cool, by the way. I like it when a movie demands that I pay attention and try to figure things out as I go along. So I have no complaints about that. But because it was nonlinear, and then you also had this stuff that felt unnecessary, the focus, as a result, also felt a bit scattered. But by the end of the movie, I felt pretty invested, and overall felt like there was a valuable balance of action and emotional character moments. And, disaster stories need personal stakes. When I see disaster movies that are just about, oh my gosh, look at all the CG destroying everything, and people have furrowed brows and are running away from tidal waves, that's not enough. I need to know the personal stakes and have a personal sense of what loss would mean for these different characters. And so I feel like they gave more to that, at least, than many DC animated movies. By the end of this one, the major threat is resolved, but the end reveals that the danger is far from over and ends on a pretty big cliffhanger, so it's certainly not resolved. It's certainly not self-contained. As far as the cast and the performances, I felt like the voice acting was all solid, but not especially memorable, apart from one emotional scene between Barry and Iris, where I felt both performances by those actors elevated and really humanized the material a lot, which is saying something when the actors can't even be seen, and there wasn't like a ton of great nuance going on in the animation. So really well done, at least in that scene in particular. Okay, the visuals. Well, I gotta say, the Tomorrowverse animated style that started however many, 8 to 10 movies ago, it uses these thick black border lines that are reminiscent of 60s cartoons or modern animation that is imitating that style, like the Archer animated series that's almost kind of making fun of 60s cartoons. And so I have a hard time taking this style seriously, and it was still a distraction for me, but at least that distraction began to lessen considerably the more I watched, but I got to say, even at the end, it was a big detriment to what could have been a much fuller enjoyment of the experience. Otherwise, I thought the cell animation looked solid. Digital effects that are, of course, added in create some cool moments. So it's really just that very personal aesthetic vibe that I don't like. I don't have any huge complaints outside of that. Let's see. Okay, themes. Is there anything of moral, philosophical, or spiritual significance going on in the themes of this thing that might trigger some worthwhile thought or conversation? Not much, but I noticed just some interesting tidbits. Vixen, as a character, officiated Barry and Iris's wedding and mentioned the background of her father being a pastor. And I did some research, and because I thought this sounded familiar, in her, she was raised by an Anglican priest or Anglican pastor, and I'd forgotten about that. But that is a part of her backstory in the comics. But I found it interesting that they would reference that instead of just having just Joe Schmo pastor officiating. Iris appeals to, during a newscast, while all crap is going on, she appeals to believers that are watching to pray, and Barry, in a final moment of desperation, says, "Please God," under his breath. So there's a little bit of this language and references to Christian faith, or what seems to be most likely specifically Christian faith in mind, that I feel like was less common about 10 years or so ago, when it was much more about just this general faith, general spirituality. It seems maybe we're taking a step back a little bit more toward referencing specifically Christian faith or Christian culture. I don't know. The Spectre, though, this surprised me. The Spectre shows up and refers to himself as the wrath of God. Now, that is what the character, from what I understand, originally was meant to be. He was the wrath of God. But at some point, they changed his concept to being referred to as the wrath of the unavenged dead. And even like when the Spectre talks about how he got his powers, how he became who he is, he would refer for many years to just this voice that kind of nudge, nudge, wink, wink. You think as a reader, oh, he's probably referring to God, but they never come out and say, well, at least in it's been many years since they've come out and said like God, and so I was really surprised. Oh, he's the wrath of who? What now? We're not going to say unavenged dead. So, and then he says something interesting that I was like, are we trying to develop a theme? Are we making a statement here? The Monitor says something like, I've never believed in you, and I'm like, well, this must be referring to something that happened in some other movie or off screen, because I have no idea what you're talking about. But the Spectre, kind of in that same conversation, says that to have hope requires faith. And so, again, I don't know if they're picking up a thread from another Tomorrowverse movie thematically, or if there's something else that they're building toward with this. It was just some interesting language going on in that scene, both in Spectre's introduction of himself and in this idea of hope requiring faith. So I don't know if we're seeing culturally a slight turn back towards some language of Christianity in fiction. I feel like I've seen little blips of that a little bit more often in the last 3 years or so, but not really the substance of Christian belief, more so just little tidbits of the language here and there. So it's just going to be interesting to see culturally where the pendulum swings and in what way it goes. So now I have no idea what your tastes are in movies, but if I were a time traveler, I'd go back in time and say, Peter, wait for all three to be released. This one was solid in some ways for your tastes, and your DC fandom, your 22 years of marriage, those are going to enhance the experience for you. But it has some action filler that you're kind of gonna zone out of, and it ultimately feels like a decent setup for the real big event story to come. This one's rated PG-13 for some violence and brief, strong language, and those are all of my thoughts for now on Justice League: Crisis on Infinite Earths, Part 1. As always, I'd love to get your thoughts and reactions in the comments below. Have you read the original Crisis on Infinite Earths? Did you watch this? How did you feel the two compare? And also, if you are willing, please like, share, subscribe, click that bell to stay connected to this content. I want to thank the Spirit Blade Insiders for making this review possible. You can get info about the benefits of joining over at patreon.com/spiritbladeproductions. Then I hope you'll check out our podcast and stay connected to all CGC content over at christiangeekcentral.com as we continue to geek out and seek the truth. For more chat about geek entertainment, answers to your questions, and news from the wider world of Christian geekery, get the Christian Geek Central podcast today on iTunes and other podcast services.